So welcome back, everyone. So one of the components that we wanted to add to the symposium was the graduate student panel, so that we can also listen to students, to people who are new to Capetillo, that they're actually reading her for the first time, and that, so we can get those first impressions and also see other perspectives. In this case, we have one of the graduate students in the MA in Spanish program, Emily Quesada. So she would be coming in from the perspective of literature. And then we have one of the graduate students in translation and interpretation studies, Alexandra O'Rourke. So she will be coming in from the perspective of her discipline. So this is a way for students also to engage with Capetillo, coming in again from those that first time that you encounter her readings. So the first portion will be this PowerPoint slide presentation. So with one part by Emily, one part by Alexandra, and then I'll have some questions, kind of like Q&A, and ideally roundtable if other people also would like to share questions and in the chat. And for this portion, Amy will be the one checking the chat to see if there's any questions for that later portion of this panel. So we can get started. So Emily, would you like to take it away?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So yes, my name is Emily Quesada Glanz. I'm in the Spanish and Portuguese department, and I decided to focus on another translated copy. Yes, thank you, titled Absolute Equality. It was edited and translated by Laura Walker. Particularly, I wanted to focus on influences of modern ideas, which was actually a play that we read in Dr. Versoto's class last spring, which caught my attention immediately. And hopefully you will see why. Just keeping a few things in mind, the importance of her audience. Obviously, we have talked a lot about Capetillo's audience. It was written in 1916, and I think that that's important to speak, is relevant the year, as a few of the topics that she brings up, or the character of Angelina brings up, which sort of captures Capetillo on her own. It's more of this, like, Capetillo uses Angelina as this character to present these topics that are important to speak on. So with that in mind, Angelina, just to give her a little context, is a daughter of a wealthy factory owner. So she does come of privilege in a sense, where there is an abundance of economic wealth in her family, which, similar to Capetillo, their lives kind of intersect. Great. So I picked a quote from each act. It's a 3-act play, this being my first one. And as I read them, keep in mind, like I said, a few of the topics that Capetillo really argues for. So the first quote is, "By educating the poor that no one has the right to place a value on one's work, nor should fixed working hours be established. Work should be free and spontaneous, and there should be equal consumption. Each individual should work according to their potential and consume according to their needs." This is like, I think in my book, I wrote amen on that particular page. Like I said, a few of the key topics we've spoken about, and Stephanie had also brought up during her talk, was this value of work and consumption and freedom and spontaneous, which I think, again, Angelina is this image of Capetillo in this play. And then we can go on to the second one. They get progressively more, in my opinion, stern and pointed and bold, and I really enjoy that. as we work through these three acts. So act number 2, Angelina, again, she states all of these. She said, "You must have exploited more." She's speaking to her father. "Buying the tobacco at a lower price. Instead of accumulating so much money, you should remember that the field hands are, with respect to civilization and progress, 2 centuries behind." So she really is this voice for the worker. "Since working the land ages them, we should afford them the means to make progress. Since their type of work does not allow them any other advantages, we should provide them with the means." She is speaking, obviously coming from this privilege, where she is speaking to her father and telling him, this is what we need to do. This is why there is this chain of exploitation in these companies, and this is how we need to fix them. And that this isn't about money, this is about people, right? And then number 3 is obviously my favorite, and hopefully you'll see why. It says, "Beautiful girls who have listened, if you wish to be free and to be mothers of conscious generations, do not get married in civil courts or in churches, because that is like selling yourself, and selling is prostitution. Love must be free, like the air that you breathe, like the flowers that open their petals to receive the fecund pollen and offer their perfume to the air. And as such, you should offer your love and prepare yourselves to have children through love." And again, I'm pretty positive I wrote amen in my book. Obviously, she is, not only is Angelina speaking to us from this perspective of, you know, there is so much more for us. And this ties into what Stephanie was speaking about, against going this institutional like format of churches and marriage, and what does that mean for women, and civil courts. You know, there's more to marriage. It's about love. It's about you know, sharing yourself, opening yourself up to more you know, experiences. That's the word I'm looking for. And like I said, Angelina really is this. You took Capetillo and everything she stands for, and everything she you know, speaks on behalf and promotes and everything, and she captured Angelina perfectly. She put herself really in this play. And obviously these are translated quotes, but I've seen the original text, and this is a beautifully done translation in English, and obviously the original being in Spanish. It really, like I said, captures these key aspects in this 3-act play, which is not very long. You know, these were things that she would read to her audiences, because most of her audience, of course, was, just like she says, you know, exploited people who were illiterate, didn't know how to read, didn't know how to write, did not have the proper education. And she shared this, this wealth, this knowledge with her audience.
Thank you, Emily, for sharing, you know, that this is, you know, a text that really struck you. This is, again, Influencias de las Ideas Modernas, and the translation by Lara Walker. And, you know, also based in connection to what we have seen so far with the earlier panels, is that, you know, and this is something that Walker remarks, that Capetillo's protagonists tend to be like the spokespeople, like the spokesperson for Capetillo's ideals. And in many ways, I mean, this is pretty much the ending of Act 3 of Influencias de las Ideas Modernas. It's like we can almost see Angelina like it's actually Capetillo right here speaking directly with that sense of, you know, wanting also to educate and the young girls, right? Like this new generation, kind of like also what she was doing with the letter to her daughter, for instance, and what she was doing also with her earlier essay. So we see that consistency in that there's a need to get this message across and to educate. So I also, and we can talk about this after Alex gives us her presentation, that so Emily, you remarked that there was an enjoyment in reading Capetillo. So we can go back to that later. So now let me mute myself and we can continue with the next part here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of text, I know, sorry. I thank you both for organizing this, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I just wanted to say, so my name is Alex. I'm in my second year in the translation program. I'm doing a Spanish to English translation, and now this year I'm working on German to English translation. And I say that just so I wanted to mention, I don't come from really a literary background. So I'm going to talk really just about how my reactions to the ensayos libertarios primarily as a translation student. And I will say, you know, I came to Spanish, I learned Spanish basically living in Colombia for 4 years, living and working there. My background in German is a little different because I studied that in college. So I did have a little more exposure to literature. So I just wanted to say that. I might repeat, hopefully not repeat a lot of what Amy talked about, but I might reiterate some of the points that she made. So we basically last spring in translation class, we looked at some fragments of ensayos libertarios and just thought about what we would need to consider if we were going to translate them. So I have not actually translated Capetillo. So this is just a list of some of the things that we think about when we see a text that we're going to translate. And as already has been mentioned, the first thing we look at usually is what type of text is this? And I will say I have not taken literary translation yet. And I'll get back to that a little bit later, but it does seem to be that there's a distinction. There's literary translation and then everything else. And we've sort of done some medical text, some legal, maybe a travel text, something like a consent form in medical as an example. And the first thing you do is you look for similar text in your target language. So in my case, English. And of course, with something like this, and I would say with literature in general, right, you can't really find, well, maybe you can, but the idea of parallel texts, definitely for Capetillo, that was not possible. So that was something I noticed right away. Of course, that it really is, especially the ensayos libertarios and oral, these are oral texts. How direct and persuasive she is really struck me. Her use of punctuation, which seems to really add to another point there, which is her sense of urgency and purpose. These are all things that stood out to us, I'll say, in the group. Another issue, of course, with grammar and punctuation mistakes, which because these were written so quickly and it looks like weren't proofread or edited, we talked about how those mistakes in a way kind of underscore the sense of urgency she wrote them with. And, should we try to preserve those? And then I'll talk about, I would say probably not, but that is definitely something that we considered. Amy also mentioned the vagueness and ambiguity in the text. So that was also something, should we try to clarify this? Is that our job as translators? I thought about target audience, right? Who will read this translation? So what kind of background knowledge will they have? And that influences a lot of other decisions. And then always, I have really, I would say, no experience translating historical text. I did just translate last week a letter from a German immigrant from 1888. And it brought up this question about, okay, this text is from 1907. should I translate into contemporary English, or maybe try to use an antiquated English? I mean, how did people speak in English in 1907, right? I would have to do a lot of research to figure that out. And is that even important? Is that something I should do in the translation? So yeah, this other point of historical research, in the group, we all realized we would need to do a lot of research. How much, not sure, but definitely research would be needed. And then the question is, okay, if you're doing a translation, you kind of have an opportunity to maybe add, to add some information about historical or cultural references that contemporary readers probably won't understand. So that question of, do I add footnotes, or should they be endnotes, or should I not add anything? So that came up. And then this is something that in my classes this semester, especially, we're talking about translation theory, and in my German to English translation class, this idea of when you're approaching a text as a translator, should I take a foreignizing approach, which would be kind of bringing the reader to Capetillo, not trying to make the text easier, more approachable, or should I try to bring Capetillo to the reader, which we would call a domesticating approach? So basically, those are just some initial considerations and challenges of the text. And then after thinking about all of these things, the idea is, right, the translator then come up with a translation strategy. So I guess we can go to the next slide, and I'll make just a couple more points. Thank you. So yeah, I definitely think a foreignizing approach is just, I would say, with historical texts in general, but that's just kind of how I feel about it. And as I think I already said, I would want to preserve the persuasiveness and the sense of urgency, because it does seem that the way she wrote and the way she lived her life, and she just had such, she believed so deeply in the causes she was fighting for. She wanted to get her ideas out there as quickly as possible and reach as many people as possible. And so I definitely would want that to come through. I agree, Amy already commented on this, to basically leave the ambiguities. Maybe some of them were intentional, right? We don't know. And yeah, to recreate a grammar or punctuation mistake, Amy and I discussed this a little bit, and I definitely agree with her that it would be kind of misrepresenting, or be taking away from her. So that I wouldn't want to do that. For the explanatory footnotes, this is something we talked a lot about in the group last spring. Should we add some, would I want to add some clarification about some cultural or historical references? And I guess in the end, I would be tempted to add a few, and that could be definitely debated. But here's one example that we did discuss in the group. So I'll just read this and talk about why I think el espectro rojo might, I would want to add one at least. Y la imposición del mercantilismo de los mal llamados discípulos y ministros de Cristo, perdón para ellos, pues también la predicación de nuestras ideas libertarias son para ellos, los de negras sotanas y sus satélites, el espectro rojo, que los hace bambolear en sus carcomidos cimientos. So we all had to do some research on this, and I am not 100% sure this is what she was referring to, but when I researched it, I found out that there was a 1907, so the same year this was published, French silent film called it, in French, El Espectro Rojo, and it was basically about demon warlocks, as far as I can, that's what I understood. So I'm not endorsing this one way or the other, but I think it's just very, it's also kind of entertaining, but powerful. It adds to the boldness of her statement. She's essentially calling priests and the clergy warlock demons, as far as I can tell. And I may be completely wrong, and I'd have to do more research, but that kind of was an example of it. Maybe I'd want to put a little note in there. But then I would say, well, yeah, but you can't have it. The more I've read of her text now, I'm realizing there'll be a lot of explanatory footnotes I would want to add, and then that might not be the best strategy. So I just wanted to bring that up because it's something that, as a translation student, it's something I think about. And yeah, at least last point on this slide. Yeah, that's okay. It's okay. Thanks. the translator, so Alan Duran West, who translated Mi Opinión, commented on how she's such a complex thinker. Many people today have already mentioned that, speakers have mentioned that. And I just like this quote, what he wrote here about this. This complexity calls upon the translator to resist making Capetillo into what she is not, a post-1960s first world feminist. I don't know enough about feminism to evaluate whether that's an accurate statement or not, but what I wanted to call to attention here is simply that, and it's probably obvious, but translators, it's to be aware, I think we call it translator bias, right? To try to not make the author you're translating into the author or the person you want them to be. Because I think translators do have that opportunity to manipulate quite a bit and maybe even do it unconsciously. So to just kind of be aware of that. And yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, so just final thoughts on this. For me, I think just the fact that it's an older text, you know, that to me, having never really not having experience with that is one of the biggest challenges, but also makes it really interesting. And another quote from Alan Duran West, I liked a lot. Any translation runs up against irrefutable distance. That distance can be temporal, linguistic, or cultural. And definitely this text that applies very much. And as I said at the beginning, this definitely underscored for me that this division in translation, it seems to be that people talk about, yeah, literature, literary translation, and then everything else or more technical translation. And I know these lines are probably blurry, but it did kind of make me realize, yeah, translating literature is really a different ball game. Not that the other kind of translation is easy, no, but you know, as the example I mentioned earlier, okay, so if it's like a consent form, I know I can go look for consent forms in English and I can find something that's going to help me. But the structure of how, the format, that way information is presented, specific vocabulary, phrasing, register, it's really, that's kind of how we're used to working. And so with literature, that's just not, it really is a different ballgame as far as I can tell. But I'm sure once I get into translating more literature, I'll have maybe other ideas about that. And finally, and Amy mentioned this as well, just the fact that Capetillo has so many different voices, and then the challenge to somehow convey all of those different voices also in the translation. And so I'll just finish with this final quote from, again, the translator of Mi Opinión. These different voices sometimes speak singly, often they overlap, and at times might even seem contradictory. But their multiple tonalities are what make Luisa Capetillo one of the most original, vibrant, and radical voices of the 20th century Caribbean. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much to our student presenters. It's very important, right, to see the perspectives from people coming in from different disciplines and approaching Capetillo for the first time. And also the fact that I think from what Emily and from what Alex just talked about is that in many ways we're seeing that Capetillo really requires, but it's like it's actually fitting to read her in community and not, not thinking of translation as this solitary practice over here that I need to just deal with these texts, but that sense of communication, right? And communicating with different mediated texts, right? And different sources. And also, with what Emily presented with Influencias de las Ideas Modernas. Pretty much in Capetillo's short plays, what she's doing is she's bringing her core ideas of education and, the rights of women and the rights of workers, and bringing those ideas that she has presented in essays, that she has, presented with that sense of orality and urgency, and in Mi Opinión and in letters, and actually have those ideas being voiced by these protagonists, that then they can actually have this more sort of like a dynamic dialogue, or trying to enter into that dialogue, like Angelina, she's using her power differential as the daughter of, you know, a well-off family, and she actually uses that power differential to challenge her father to think in terms of what about, you know, the material realities and the rights of the workers that you have been exploiting. So she uses that also. So we see Capetillo bringing in her ideas and having this protagonist, these young women, right, voice those ideas and have those ideas then be presented in this interactive fashion that, again, if you were not a worker at the factory and you had, again, you didn't have access to learning how to read or write, you could still listen to people enacting or reading out loud these ideas as a play. And in that sense, you're also receiving not just, you know, what would be you're listening to the speech, but you're also seeing like how that could be voiced by a young woman and challenging aspects that have to do with, you know, the economy and the state and the church. So that, I think it also, right, makes us think of Capetillo is meant to be enacted in so many ways and to be discussed and studied in, you know, in collaboration and in communication. And, you know, coming in from so many also different disciplines, right? The literary aspect, the translation and interpretation, that there's still so many, you know, like influences and aspects of her that have been mentioned and studied, but maybe, you know, like Stephanie was mentioning earlier today, that spiritism and actually getting deeper into that spiritism in connection, right, to that social activism. How does it feel, that very Capetillo brand of that social activism at the time in her context, you know, and something I have mentioned to my students, which is an idea that we discussed like 15 years ago at a symposium about Capetillo with Norma Valle and Carmen Centeno. More in-depth studies about how Capetillo uses fashion, not just for the practicality, but also as that public persona, right? And how she's using that in a way to also be that, you know, unruly agent of the counter archive, you know, like with the history of fashion, for instance, and how she's presenting herself. So many ways to go. But again, I wanted to highlight that from the, you know, from what we heard from Emily and what we heard from Alex, again, who are people who are students who are for the first time encountering Capetillo, we see that the importance of getting these ideas into dialogues and into dialogue and creating and continuing those dialogues and conversations about her. I mentioned to Emily the idea of enjoyment, right? That reading Capetillo brought you enjoyment, you know, and sometimes we read and it's important, but that idea of also having that personal reaction, that you're in that sense, you are connecting in a very personal way, which is, I mean, it is important, right? Because a lot of these, these topics are very relevant today, slightly different context, but at the core, right, we're still grappling with a lot of the core coloniality of a lot of these topics. So, and I know that these questions may not actually, oh, there's a question here. So Capetillo has been called the Emma Goldman of Puerto Rico. Has anyone compared her essays to the writings of speeches of Emma Goldman? So it is, I mean, it is true, right, that there is that, that connection, right, in the sense of how they use the philosophy, the influence of anarchism. I am not sure, maybe some of the other Capetillistas here in the audience, if there has been like a more in-depth study about a comparison and contrast study. Not that I can think of right now. So if anybody may have that information, if you want to drop it in the chat, otherwise, that's yet another project right there with just like the one about fashion and working in collaboration. And then, you know, like in that sense, exploring the philosophy of Capetillo in connection and her thoughts, or el ideario capetillano, with similar figures at the time, right? And also contrasting them. So that's a really good question and a, you know, a good thing to think about. Okay, so Now, questions that I had, you know, when I met with the students, with Emily and with Alex, and I said, you know, this is not about you coming in as an expert. Actually, it's the opposite. It's about, again, trying also for some of the other Capetillistas here to remember what it was like, right, to encounter Capetillo for the first time. Anything, either Emily or Alex, that you would like to remark about the impressions, the challenges, your reaction to her writings?
Well, I think personally, just being in your class, we went through a lot of text even before at Capetillo, and I don't think it was until Capetillo where she brings to our attention such key topics, like you said, education, like exploitation of workers, you know, this gap between the wealthy and the poor. And I don't think it was until we read Influences of Modern Ideas that I felt an author or a writer capture these topics in a way where it was so impactful. It wasn't, you know, she didn't, you know, say that this is wrong, this is how we need to do this. You know, we need to not exploit our workers. It was more of a, this is like what a mother would tell a child, these like learning lessons, and would give an alternative to fixing them. I think is key for her.
Yeah, and I mean, that is a good point, that you find that she's grappling again with the colonial, being the colonial subject, all the complexities and perceived contradictions. And again, we can read them differently, as you know, as Stephanie invited us to do earlier today, because also the environment is contradictory, and she is presenting these ideas again, highlighting that value of education, that education could be conveyed in ways that, again, it doesn't, you can educate people at the factory, you can educate people by writing these essays and having someone read them or enact them, you know, if it's a play, that there are ways of creating that community, right? That, you know, some of these topics we see with other writers. And for instance, you know, when I have taught mi opinion in when the times that I have taught the Latin American essay seminar, you know, we can think of José Martí, right, and Nuestra América, and a lot of the topics about, you know, la colonia siguió viviendo en la república. So that idea that, you know, the structures and the dynamics don't disappear just because, you know, you become a republic. I mean, it's a process then, because these are entrenched structures. And so Capetillo is also thinking of in those terms, but she's also incorporating women into that new nation that needs to actually do away with that, you know, with that colonialist legacy, right? So we see kind of like the same topics, but she has that very raw, urgent, lived experience, right? Especially because she's a subject from the margins. Okay. And yes, there is a power differential, right? She's coming in from a family of 19th century immigrants who had an education. It's not like she, you know, she was like a third generation daughter of, you know, more like Black indigenous people in the island, but still, you know, she is a woman who had children out of wedlock. She is not from the intelligentsia. So using, even from that relative position, right, of then using the resources that you have in order to create that awareness and also using that presence. So yeah, there's something impactful about finding that is not just aquí está el discurso, right, here's my speech, but there's also my life, like my that embodiment of, you know, of that experience. Okay,
Nancy, if I could, I just wanted to connect what you're talking about right now, just like all of this context, like we think about this like idea, we were talking about this yesterday, Nancy, of like indexicality, right? How meaning is just meaning because of the context that it sits in, and that's how we understand that. So I wanted to connect sort of that point that you're making of all this other context of who she is with something that Alex said that I, really appreciated. Which was, and then I wanted to kind of shift it over to Jordan, who can hopefully speak to this as a historian. This idea of there, if we're working with these texts or a text like the ones that we just translated, how do translators approach them in terms of the amount of information that they add in? So one of our strategies as translators, in literary texts and different kinds of texts, and depending on the audience and the reasons we're translating it and all these things, right, that are the approach we take has its own context. One of the strategies we use is to gloss, right, to add, to explain, to expand. If we're intercultural communicators, LACUSL calls this expansionary tactics, right? So footnoting, creating an appendix, which is one of the things that we did with this version, is just creating a very brief appendix of citations. Who are these people that are being cited? Where are they writing from? What's their original language? Do we have information on their original text, etc.? So I just think about how much do we add, how much of that historical, especially in a text like this with Capetillo's text, how much of that do we add in as non-historians, right? Here in a text like that, I would see a really great moment for more of a annotated academic version of a text in collaboration with a historian. So I just wanted to get your sense of that. Do you see these texts as calling for more intervention, explanatory, or at least contextualization of the text?
Should I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I absolutely agree. And I think that, these texts that Capetillo published, so I just want to go back to this quote that Alex had of Alan Duran talking about, post-1960s feminism, and not, being careful of not actually changing what Capetillo meant. But I think that Capetillo itself, we resignify Capetillo every time we read Capetillo or every time we're in a space. And so I think that having these translations annotated is super useful, particularly when thinking about new audiences coming in and interpreting Capetillo, because I am from a school of thought that thinks that the past is not fixed and it's constantly changing. And so I think that these annotated translations allow us to keep changing that past and mutating the past, right? And so I think so I'm really grateful for the work that you all are doing, because I think it will allow for more conversations and for us to situate Capetillo in different sort of conceptions of the past. So absolutely, I think it is of great service, not only for general audiences that might not know details that you're providing in those annotations, but it also allows for different historical interpretations of the context that Capetillo navigated as well.
Right. Well, thank you. I want to thank everyone who joined the panel, and to our student panelists today, to Emily and Alex. And then, so Julie, you can stop recording this portion.